Forget what you think you know about traffic stops. Tonight, we're riding shotgun with a San Diego Highway Patrol officer into the absolute unknown. From high-speed chases to discovering the truly unexplainable, you won't believe the dangers and strange occurrences that unfold after midnight on these roads. My name is James Hartley, and for the past 3 years, I've worked the midnight shift as a highway patrol officer in San Diego, California. What I'm about to tell you isn't some fictional campfire story designed to give you a cheap thrill. This is my reality. These are the things I've witnessed with my own 2 eyes. The encounters that have made me question everything I thought I understood about the world we live in. By the time I'm finished, you'll understand why some of us carry more than just a service weapon when we patrol these highways after dark. It all started on my first night of the midnight shift. I had transferred from the day patrol, eager for the extra pay and the relative calm that everyone said came with working when most of the city was asleep. My training officer, a grizzled veteran named Ricardo Vasquez, picked me up at the station at exactly 11:45 that night. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. When I climbed into the passenger seat of his cruiser, he handed me a small, leather-bound book without saying a word. The cover was worn, the edges frayed from years of handling. There was no title, no indication of what was inside. When I opened it, I found a list of rules written in neat, precise handwriting. Some of them had been crossed out and rewritten. Others had notes scrawled in the margins, as if previous owners had added their own observations over time. "Read those carefully," Ricardo said as he pulled out of the station parking lot. "Memorize every single one of them. Your life depends on it." I laughed, thinking he was hazing the new guy. Midnight shift officers were known for their dark humor and elaborate pranks. But when I looked at Ricardo's face, there wasn't even a hint of a smile. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. The first rule was simple enough. Never stop for a vehicle with no visible driver after 2 a.m. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. How could there be a vehicle without a driver? Was this some kind of test? The second rule sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't explain. If you see a hitchhiker wearing a white dress on the shoulder of the interstate, do not acknowledge them. Do not look at them. Do not slow down. Keep driving as if you see nothing at all. Rule 3 was even more unsettling. If your radio plays static for exactly 13 seconds, leave your current location immediately. Do not wait for dispatch confirmation. Do not investigate the cause. Just drive. There were more rules, each one more bizarre than the last. Some mentioned specific locations along the San Diego highway system. Mile marker 66 on Interstate 8 appeared multiple times, always with the same warning. Never respond to calls from this location, no matter how urgent they sound. Others referenced specific times of night, narrow windows where certain sections of road became, according to the notes, active. "Is this serious?" I finally asked, closing the book. Ricardo didn't answer immediately. We were merging onto Interstate 5, the lights of downtown San Diego glittering in the distance like fallen stars. The Pacific Ocean stretched out to our left, invisible in the darkness, but present in the salty tang of the air that seeped through the cruiser's vents. 3 years ago, he finally said, his voice low, a rookie named Tommy Breslin thought those rules were a joke. He'd been on the midnight shift for about 2 weeks when he responded to a call at mile marker 66. Dispatch never sent that call. When we found his cruiser the next morning, it was empty. Engines still running. Lights still flashing. But Tommy was gone. They never found him, James. Not a trace. No body. No evidence of foul play. Nothing. He just vanished. The city lights reflected off the hood of our cruiser as we drove in silence. I wanted to believe Ricardo was still hazing me, that this was all an elaborate setup, but something in his voice told me otherwise. There was pain there, buried beneath the gruff exterior. Tommy Breslin hadn't just been a colleague. He'd been a friend. The highways change after midnight, Ricardo continued. San Diego is a beautiful city during the day. Tourists, beaches, perfect weather. But when the sun goes down and the streets empty out, something else wakes up. Something that's been here longer than the city, longer than the roads we patrol. We don't talk about it, not officially. But every officer who works this shift long enough learns the truth. Those rules weren't written as a joke. They were written in blood by officers who learned the hard way what happens when you ignore them. My first encounter happened around 3 a.m. that very night. We were patrolling a stretch of Interstate 15 near Miramar when I spotted a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder about a quarter mile ahead. It was a black sedan, older model, maybe from the 80s. The hazard lights were on, blinking a steady rhythm that seemed out of sync with everything else, like a heartbeat that didn't quite match the pulse of the world around it. "Should we check it out?" I asked, reaching for the radio. Ricardo's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with surprising force. "Look at the driver's seat," he said quietly. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out details in the darkness. The sedan was about 50 yards ahead now, and as we approached, I could see clearly through the back window. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The entire vehicle appeared to be completely unoccupied, but the hazard lights kept blinking. And as we drove past, I could have sworn I saw the steering wheel turn slightly, adjusting course for a road it wasn't moving on. "Rule 1, Ricardo said, accelerating past the sedan without a second glance. "Never stop for a vehicle with no visible driver after 2 a.m. That thing has been appearing on this stretch of road for as long as anyone can remember. Different officers have tried approaching it over the years. The ones who were lucky came back shaken, but alive. The others didn't come back at all. I watched in the side mirror as the sedan grew smaller behind us. Just before it disappeared from view, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure had appeared in the driver's seat, pale and motionless, watching us drive away. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. "Don't look back," Ricardo warned, as if reading my thoughts. Some of them know when they're being watched. Looking gives them power, acknowledgement. It's like an invitation. The rest of that first night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. When my shift ended and the sun began to rise over the mountains to the east, I drove home in a daze. I sat in my apartment, the leather-bound book of rules on my kitchen table, and read through every entry again. There were 37 rules in total, each one accompanied by cryptic notes and warnings. Some rules applied only to specific stretches of highway. Others were time-sensitive, relevant only during certain hours or phases of the moon. One rule, underlined 3 times and circled in red ink, stood out from the rest. If you ever see a patrol car with a license plate DMND 000, do not follow it. Do not attempt to make contact. That vehicle is not part of our fleet. It never has been. I didn't sleep that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty sedan and the figure that had materialized inside it. I saw Ricardo's face, weathered and worn, bearing the scars of years spent patrolling highways that most people would never understand. I thought about Tommy Breslin, the rookie who had vanished without a trace, and I wondered how many other officers had met similar fates over the years. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, I sat in my cruiser outside the station and made a decision. I wasn't going to run from this. I had joined the highway patrol to protect people, to serve my community, to make a difference. Whatever was happening on these highways after midnight, I was going to face it head on. But first, I needed to understand it. The midnight sky stretched above San Diego like a canvas of infinite darkness, punctuated by the distant lights of airplanes descending toward Lindbergh Field and the faint glow of stars struggling to shine through the urban luminescence. As I pulled onto Interstate 5 for my second night of patrol, Ricardo riding silently beside me, I felt the weight of the book in my pocket like a talisman against whatever horrors awaited. "Tonight," Ricardo said, breaking the silence. You're going to see more. And when you do, you're going to want to help. That's the instinct, the training. But you need to remember something important, James. On this shift, in these hours, not everything that looks like a victim is actually a victim. Not everything that calls for help actually needs saving. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is answer. The radio crackled, and dispatch reported a stranded motorist near Solana Beach. We responded, keeping to the rules, watching the shadows for anything that moved wrong. But in the back of my mind, one thought lingered, refusing to fade. What exactly had I gotten myself into? The stranded motorist near Solana Beach turned out to be a young woman in her 20s with a flat tire and a dead cell phone. She was genuinely grateful when we arrived, relief flooding her face as our cruiser's headlights illuminated her disabled vehicle on the shoulder of the 101. Ricardo handled the situation with practiced efficiency while I stood watch, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of our lights. Nothing unusual happened during that stop, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It was subtle, like the pressure of eyes on the back of your neck when you're alone in an empty room. The ocean was close enough that I could hear the waves crashing against the shore somewhere in the blackness, a rhythmic sound that should have been soothing, but felt somehow ominous in the context of what I'd already witnessed. You feel it, don't you? Ricardo asked as we drove away, leaving the young woman to continue her journey home. Feel what? The watching. It starts subtle, just a tickle at the edge of your awareness. But it never really goes away, not during these hours. The highways are older than people realize. The indigenous peoples who lived here long before the Spanish arrived knew to avoid certain paths after dark. They had their own names for what lives in the spaces between places, the things that travel roads that exist alongside our own. I wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any profession that deals regularly with death and danger. But I had seen the empty sedan. I had watched that figure materialize in the driver's seat. Whatever was happening on these highways, it was real. The weeks that followed were an education in terror. On my third night of patrol, I witnessed my first high-speed pursuit under the midnight sky. A vehicle ran a checkpoint near the border, tearing north on Interstate 5 at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. We gave chase, Ricardo handling the cruiser with a skill that came from decades of experience. The pursuit lasted for nearly 15 minutes, weaving through the sparse late-night traffic, our sirens cutting through the darkness. Then, without warning, the fleeing vehicle vanished. I don't mean it pulled off the highway or crashed into the underbrush. I mean it simply ceased to exist. One moment, its taillights were visible ahead of us, no more than 100 yards distant. The next, there was nothing but empty road stretching toward the horizon. Ricardo immediately pulled off the highway, making a U-turn through an emergency vehicle crossing. We drove in the opposite direction for nearly 20 minutes before he said anything. Rule 7, he finally explained. If a vehicle you're pursuing suddenly vanishes, return to the station immediately and do not attempt to resume the chase. Whatever that vehicle was, it wasn't going where we could follow. But what about the driver? What about catching whoever was behind the wheel? Ricardo shook his head slowly. There was no driver, James. That vehicle was bait. Something out there learns our patterns, our instincts. It knows that we chase. It knows that we follow. And it uses that against us, leading officers down roads that don't exist on any map. The ones who don't turn back end up like Tommy. The ones who do turn back get to live another night. The station was quiet when we returned. A few days shift officers were beginning to filter in as our shift ended, but no one asked about our early return. It was an unspoken understanding among those who worked these hours. Sometimes you came back early. Sometimes you came back shaken. The important thing was that you came back at all. Over the following months, I learned the rhythms of the midnight shift in ways that no training manual could ever capture. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated something wasn't right. The way the air would grow heavy before an encounter. the manner in which sounds seemed to distort and stretch when certain locations approached. I learned to trust my instincts, even when they told me things that defied rational explanation. There was a night in February when I encountered the hitchhiker in white for the first time. I was patrolling alone by then, Ricardo having certified me for solo duty after 6 months of training. It was around 2:30 a.m., and I was cruising along a quiet stretch of Interstate 8 near El Cajon. The mountains loomed to the north, their peaks invisible against the darker darkness of the sky. To the south, the lights of the city flickered like dying candles. I saw her standing on the shoulder of the road about a quarter mile ahead. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, with long dark hair that hung past her shoulders. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in my headlights, as if it were generating its own luminescence. Her feet were bare, and she stood perfectly still, one hand raised in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. Every instinct that screamed at me to stop. Here was a young woman, alone and vulnerable, on a deserted highway in the middle of the night. What kind of officer, what kind of human being would I be if I drove past without offering assistance? But I remembered the rule. Do not acknowledge them. Do not look at them. Do not slow down. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, fighting the urge to glance in her direction. As I passed the spot where she stood, the temperature inside my cruiser dropped by at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath misting in the air before me, and frost began to form on the inside of my windshield. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and melodic, coming from the passenger seat beside me. Why won't you stop for me? I didn't look. I didn't respond. I pressed the accelerator and put as much distance between myself and that stretch of road as my cruiser could manage. The voice asked the same question twice more, growing fainter each time, until it faded completely somewhere around the Grossmont summit. When I finally allowed myself to breathe, I was shaking so badly that I had to pull off at the next exit and collect myself. There was no one in my passenger seat. There had never been anyone there. But the frost on my windshield was real, and when I touched the seat beside me, the leather was ice cold. Later that night, I asked Elena Morales about the hitchhiker. Elena was a veteran of the midnight shift, a tough woman in her 40s who had seen things that would break most people. She was one of the few officers who would speak openly about the encounters, and she had taken me under her wing after Ricardo retired earlier that year. She's been appearing on that stretch of road since the 70s, Elena told me. The story goes that she was a young woman who was killed by a hit-and-run driver while walking home from party. Her body was never found, and her killer was never caught. Now she wanders the highway, looking for the driver who killed her, or maybe looking for someone to take her home. Nobody really knows. What happens if you stop for her? Elena's expression darkened. Nobody who stopped has ever been able to tell us. We've found abandoned cruisers. We've found officers who came back changed, unable to speak about what happened. Their hair turned white overnight. And we found officers who simply vanished, just like Tommy Breslin. Whatever she is, whatever she wants, it's nothing good. The psychological toll of these encounters was something I hadn't anticipated when I first transferred to the midnight shift. During the day, I found myself jumping at shadows, unable to fully relax. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by dreams of empty roads and figures that materialized from darkness. I began to understand why so many officers who work these hours develop habits that bordered on the obsessive, rituals and routines designed to maintain some semblance of control in a world that had revealed itself to be far stranger than anyone on the outside would ever believe. There were the immediate dangers, too, the mundane horrors that didn't require supernatural explanation. I dealt with drunk drivers who had killed entire families, their bloodshot eyes showing no comprehension of the devastation they had caused. I witnessed high-speed crashes that reduced vehicles to unrecognizable masses of twisted metal and shattered glass. I stood over bodies on the asphalt, waiting for the corner while traffic crawled past, curious faces pressed against windows, eager for a glimpse of tragedy. But those encounters, as terrible as they were, followed rules that I understood. The bizarre phenomena that emerged after midnight operated according to a different logic entirely, one that I was only beginning to comprehend. On a warm night in April, I received a call that would change everything I thought I knew about the highways and the things that patrolled them alongside us. The call came from dispatch at exactly 2:47 a.m. There was a report of a vehicle fire near mile marker 66 on Interstate 8, with possible victims trapped inside. I was the closest unit, positioned about 5 miles east of the location. I reached for my radio to respond, then stopped. Mile marker 66. The location mentioned repeatedly in the Book of Rules, always with the same warning. Never respond to calls from this location, no matter how urgent they sound. My finger hovered over the transmit button. Somewhere out there, people might be burning alive, trapped in a vehicle engulfed in flames. Every second of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. But the rules existed for a reason. Officers had died learning those reasons. Officers had vanished. I made a decision that still haunts me to this day. I didn't respond to the call. Instead, I drove in the opposite direction, putting as much distance between myself and mile marker 66 as possible. 15 minutes later, dispatch reported that another unit had investigated the scene and found nothing. No vehicle fire, no victims, no evidence that anything had occurred at that location at all. Whatever had generated that call, it hadn't been human, and it had been waiting for someone to answer. The summer brought with it a series of encounters that tested the limits of my sanity. San Diego's highways became a theater of the impossible, each night unveiling new horrors that defied explanation. I had long since stopped questioning whether what I witnessed was real. The scars, both physical and psychological, were proof enough. It was during July, on a night when the Santa Ana winds blew hot and dry from the inland deserts, that I made the discovery at the abandoned rest stop. The rest stop had been closed for years, a victim of budget cuts and declining use. It sat along a forgotten stretch of State Route 67, accessible only via an off-ramp that most GPS systems no longer recognized. I had no reason to be there that night. No call from dispatch. No logical explanation for why my cruiser steering wheel seemed to turn of its own accord, guiding me down that exit and into the crumbling parking lot. When I stepped out of my vehicle, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The Santa Ana winds had been howling all night, bending trees and sending debris skittering across the asphalt. But here, in this forgotten place, the air was completely still. Not a whisper of movement, not a single sound save for the beating of my own heart. The second thing I noticed was the vehicles. They filled the parking lot, row after row of them, makes and models spanning decades. There was a Model T Ford parked beside a 1950s Cadillac, which sat next to a 1980s minivan, which was adjacent to a modern Tesla. All of them were empty. All of them were in pristine condition. And all of them had California plates that, when I ran them through my system, came back as belonging to missing persons, drivers who had vanished on San Diego highways over the past century. I counted 47 vehicles before I stopped counting. In the center of the parking lot stood a structure that hadn't been part of the original rest stop design. It was a circular arrangement of stones, each one standing about 3 feet tall, positioned with a precision that suggested deliberate placement rather than random occurrence. The stones were covered in markings that I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of my eye. Sitting in the center of the stone circle was a single item, a highway patrol hat, the style unchanged since the 1970s, bearing a badge number that I would later confirm belonged to an officer who had disappeared in 1978. I didn't approach the circle. Something in me, some primal instinct that predated rational thought, screamed at me to stay back. Instead, I took photographs with my phone, documenting everything I could from the safety of the parking lot's perimeter. When I returned to my cruiser and drove away, I glanced at my rearview mirror. The parking lot was empty. The vehicles were gone. The stone circle had vanished. All that remained was the cracked asphalt and the weeds growing through the cracks, undisturbed by any evidence of what I had witnessed. The photographs on my phone showed nothing but an empty rest stop. Stories circulated among the midnight shift officers, shared in hushed tones during the quiet hours before dawn. Elena Morales told me about the school bus she had encountered one night on Interstate 805. A vintage yellow bus from the 1960s filled with children who pressed their pale faces against the windows as she passed. The bus matched the description of one that had gone off a cliff in 1967, killing all 42 passengers. It was never found. Another officer, a quiet man named Daniel Reyes who rarely spoke about his experiences, told me about the night he pulled over what he thought was a routine traffic violator, only to discover that the driver had been dead for at least a week. The body was decomposed, flesh sloughing off bone, yet the hands still gripped the steering wheel with rigor mortis rigidity. When Daniel had reached through the window to check for a pulse, the corpse's head had turned to face him, and a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed had whispered his full name, his date of birth, and the exact date and time he would die. Daniel refused to tell anyone what that date was. He retired from the force 3 months later and moved to a landlocked state in the Midwest, as far from highways as he could get. The most bizarre encounter I personally experienced occurred on an October night that I will never forget. I was patrolling northbound on Interstate 5, approaching the interchange with Interstate 805, when I spotted a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. It was a recent model sedan, nothing unusual about it except for the fact that I couldn't identify the make or model despite my extensive training. The badge on the hood bore no recognizable logo, and the design of the vehicle seemed to shift slightly each time I looked at it, as if it couldn't quite decide what kind of car it wanted to be. I approached cautiously, one hand on my weapon, the rules of the book cycling through my mind. The driver's window was down, and as I drew closer, I could hear music playing from inside the vehicle. It was a song I recognized from my childhood, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, but played backward in a half speed. The familiar melody transformed into something deeply unsettling. The driver turned to face me as I reached the window. He was a middle-aged man in a suit, his features completely ordinary except for his eyes. Where his eyes should have been, there were 2 swirling voids, black holes that seemed to contain infinite depth. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you know the way to Coronado?" I had received this question before, during legitimate traffic encounters. Tourists often got lost trying to find a famous island community with its resort hotels and beautiful beaches. But something about the way this man asked, the wrongness of his voice and eyes, told me that he wasn't looking for directions. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't help you with that," I said, backing away slowly. "Everyone knows the way to Coronado," the man continued, his lipless mouth forming words that didn't quite sync with the sounds I heard. "You just have to want to get there badly enough. The bridge is always open, officer, even when they close it, especially when they close it." He smiled then, and I saw that he had no teeth. His mouth was simply a dark opening that led to the same void I had seen in his eyes, an endless nothing that pulled at my attention like a magnet pulling at iron filings. I returned to my cruiser and drove away without looking back. When I checked the location on my dashcam footage later, the entire encounter had been replaced by 17 minutes of static. The Coronado Bridge held particular significance in the Book of Rules. Rule 23 stated explicitly, never pull over on the Coronado Bridge between 3 and 4 a.m. Rule 24 added, if you see emergency lights on the bridge during these hours, do not stop to assist. They are not seeking help. They are seeking company. The bridge had a dark history that extended beyond the supernatural. Since its completion in 1969, it had been the site of numerous suicides, individuals who had climbed the railings and plunged into San Diego Bay more than 200 feet below. The design of the bridge, with its graceful curve and stunning views, had become a beacon for the despairing. What the public didn't know, what only those who patrol these highways after midnight understood, was that not all of those who went over the railings had done so voluntarily. Something lived on that bridge in the dark hours, something that fed on despair and multiplied hopelessness. Officers who had stopped during the forbidden hours reported feeling an overwhelming urge to climb the rails themselves, a compulsion that grew stronger with each passing second. 3 officers had died on that bridge since 1985. Their deaths were officially ruled suicides. Those of us who worked the midnight shift knew better. The things I found during traffic stops defied rational categorization. A minivan full of mannequins arranged in family tableaus, complete with clothing and wigs, traveling 65 miles per hour with no living driver visible. A pickup truck carrying 47 identical suitcases, each one containing a single human tooth wrapped in wax paper. A motorcycle rider wearing medieval armor, his visor raised to reveal a face that was simply smooth skin, no eyes or nose or mouth. Just unbroken flesh from hairline to chin. Each encounter followed a pattern I was beginning to recognize. The phenomena appeared most frequently between 2 and 4 a.m., peaked in intensity around 3:33, and diminished as dawn approached. Certain locations serve as focal points, mile marker 66 being the most powerful, but there were others scattered throughout the highway system like nodes in a network of nightmares. The strangest discovery came on a night in November when I responded to a legitimate call about debris in the roadway on Interstate 15. What I found wasn't debris in any conventional sense. It was a door, a wooden door, standing upright in the middle of the northbound lanes, complete with a brass knob and hinges that connected to nothing. It was painted red, the color of dry blood, and it stood perfectly stable despite the traffic that I had stopped a quarter mile back. When I approached the door, I could hear sounds coming from the other side. Voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were describing me, my appearance, my location, my thoughts. They knew that I was afraid. They knew that I wanted to open the door. And they knew exactly what would happen if I did. I called for a tow truck and traffic control, and together we managed to transport the door to the impound lot without anyone touching it. By morning, it had vanished from the evidence cage, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the faint echo of laughter. These encounters accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of impossibility that reshaped my understanding of reality. The San Diego I knew during the day, the city of sunshine and beaches and tourist attractions, was a mask worn by something far older and far stranger. And every night, I patrolled the seams where that mask slipped, where the true face of the highways revealed itself to those unlucky enough to witness it. What I didn't know yet, what I would soon learn, was that the phenomena weren't random. They followed patterns that extended back centuries, and they were building toward something, converging on a night that would test every rule I had learned and every survival instinct I possessed. The emotional weight of the midnight shift was something that no amount of training could prepare you for. I had seen colleagues crack under the pressure, their minds unable to reconcile the impossibilities they witnessed with the rational world they had always believed in. Some left the force entirely, moving to other careers where the most frightening thing they encountered was a difficult client or an unexpected deadline. Others turned to substances, trying to numb the memories that lurked behind their eyes. A few sought more permanent solutions, and their deaths were never investigated as deeply as they should have been. Those of us who remained developed coping mechanisms. We learned to compartmentalize, to build walls between the life we lived during daylight hours and the reality we faced after midnight. We found comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythms of patrol patterns and radio check-ins. And we found strength in each other, in the silent understanding shared by those who had seen the impossible and survived. Elena Morales became my anchor during those years. She had been working the midnight shift for nearly 2 decades, longer than anyone else in the department. Her face bore the marks of that tenure, lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless days, a set to her jaw that came from too many unexplainable encounters. But she was still standing, still patrolling, still alive. And that gave me hope. The trick, Elena told me one night as we sat in a diner that stayed open 24 hours, our cruisers parked side by side in the lot outside, is to stop asking why. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to understand things that weren't meant to be understood. The phenomena don't follow our rules, our logic, our expectations. They exist on a different frequency, one that human minds weren't designed to receive. The best we can do is learn the patterns, follow the rules, and survive long enough to retire. But where do they come from? I asked. What are they? Elena stirred her coffee slowly, watching the steam rise from the cup. I've heard theories over the years. Some officers think they're ghosts, spirits of the dead who can't move on because of the violence that occurs on these roads. Others think they're demons, entities that have been here since before humans, feeding on the energy of our fear and suffering. A few believe there's something even older, things that existed before the concept of life and death, before the universe divided itself into categories we can comprehend. She set down her spoon and met my eyes. Personally, I think they're part of the highway itself. Roads are strange things, James. They connect places, but they also create spaces, in-between zones that aren't quite one place or another. Millions of people travel through those zones every day, bringing their emotions, their fears, their deaths. All that energy has to go somewhere. Maybe it accumulates. Maybe it takes form. Maybe what we're seeing isn't something separate from the highway, but the highway's dreams made manifest. I thought about her words for a long time after that conversation. The highway's dreams. It was a poetic way of describing something that defied poetry, but it resonated with my experiences. The phenomena did seem connected to the roads themselves, to specific locations and routes, as if the asphalt and concrete had developed a consciousness of their own. The story of Ricardo Vasquez weighed heavily on my mind during this period. Ricardo had retired after certifying me for solo patrol, but he hadn't left voluntarily. He had been forced out after an incident that the department refused to discuss openly, an incident that had occurred on the night of his 30-year anniversary with the highway patrol. I learned the details from Elena, who had been present when it happened. Ricardo had responded to a call at mile marker 66 on Interstate 8. Not a call from dispatch, but something that came through his radio on a frequency that wasn't part of any official broadcast. It was the voice of his wife, Maria, who had died of cancer 3 years earlier. She was calling for help, begging him to come find her, describing the darkness where she was trapped and the things that were hunting her. Ricardo knew the rules better than anyone. He had written some of them himself. But love, Elena explained, was stronger than reason. Ricardo had driven a mile marker 66 and exited his vehicle. He had walked toward a light that only he could see, following Maria's voice into the desert beyond the shoulder of the road. When they found him 2 days later, he was sitting cross-legged in the middle of a dried riverbed, nearly 20 miles from where his cruiser had been abandoned. He was alive, physically unharmed, but something essential had been taken from him. He couldn't remember his own name. He couldn't recognize his colleagues or his children. He stared at the world with eyes that seemed to see something other than what was in front of him, something that made him smile, a gentle, distant smile that never quite reached his voice. Ricardo spent his remaining days in a care facility, attended by nurses who wondered at the strange words he sometimes whispered in his sleep, words in a language that no linguist could identify. The story was a warning, but it was also a tragedy. Ricardo had been a good officer, a good man, dedicated to protecting people from the dangers of the road. His dedication had been used against him, weaponized by something that understood human emotion well enough to exploit it. I began to research the history of San Diego's highways, searching for patterns, for explanations, for anything that might help me understand what I was facing. What I discovered was both enlightening and disturbing. The phenomena weren't new. They had been reported since the earliest days of the automobile age, since the first roads were paved across the desert landscape that would become one of America's largest cities. But they had grown stronger over the decades, more frequent and more intense, as if they were feeding on the traffic that flowed through them like blood through veins. Indigenous peoples who had lived in the region for thousands of years before European contact had their own names for the forces that inhabited these spaces. They spoke of trickster spirits that traveled the trade routes, of shapeshifters that appeared as fellow travelers only to lead the unwary into traps. They warned of certain paths that should never be walked after sunset, of places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin enough to cross. The highways have been built over many of those ancient paths, their routes determined by the same geographical features that had guided travelers for millennia. The phenomena seemed strongest where the modern roads intersected with the old trails, as if the paving over sacred ground had disturbed something that should have remained dormant. Mile marker 66, I discovered, was located directly above a site that had been avoided by the Kumeyaay people for generations. They called it something that roughly translated to the place where the earth breathes, and they believed it was a portal between worlds, a doorway that opened on certain nights to admit beings that did not belong in our reality. This knowledge gave me context, but it didn't provide protection. The rules remained my only reliable defense, memorized so thoroughly that I could recite them in my sleep. And as the years passed, I added my own observations to the margins of the book, continuing the tradition of officers who had come before me. The camaraderie among midnight shift officers was unlike anything I had experienced in other assignments. We didn't just work together, we survived together. We covered for each other during difficult encounters, shared information about new phenomena, and provided a shoulder to lean on when the weight became too heavy to bear alone. There were rituals that had developed over the years, unofficial traditions that helped maintain sanity. Before every shift, we would gather in the break room and share stories, not about the encounters themselves, but about our lives outside the job. We talked about families, hobbies, favorite restaurants, anything that reminded us that we were more than just officers who faced the impossible. It grounded us in humanity, gave us something to hold on to when the phenomena tried to pull us away. At the end of every shift, we would meet at a specific location, a parking lot overlooking the ocean where the first light of dawn would spread across the water like a promise of safety. We would sit in silence, watching the sun rise, reminding ourselves that night always ended, that the phenomena retreated with the darkness, that we had survived once more. The night that everything changed began like any other. It was February, and the weather had turned cold by San Diego standards, temperatures dipping into the 40s with a wind that carried the scent of rain from the approaching storm front. I reported for duty at 11:45, attended the pre-shift gathering in the break room, and drove out onto the empty highways with a sense of routine familiarity. But something was different. The air felt charged, electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. The phenomena that typically appeared sporadically throughout the night were everywhere, crowding the edges of my vision, whispering from the shadows beyond my headlights. I saw the black sedan with no driver 3 times in the first hour. The hitchhiker in white appeared on every stretch of road I patrolled, her figure flickering in and out of visibility like a broken transmission. My radio cycled through frequencies on its own, playing snippets of conversations that had occurred years ago, decades ago, voices of officers long dead, discussing encounters that had become legend. When dispatch received reports of multiple vehicle fires, accidents, and distressed travelers throughout the county, all concentrated in the early morning hours, I knew that something unprecedented was happening. The phenomena weren't just active. They were building toward a climax. Elena's voice came over the radio at 2:33 a.m., tense but controlled. All units, be advised. We're seeing activity levels that exceed anything in recorded history. Follow your rules. Trust your instincts. Do not, under any circumstances, deviate from established protocols. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., my radio locked onto a single frequency and played a message that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Officer Hartley," the voice said, and it was Ricardo's voice, unmistakable despite the static that underlay it. "The door is opening. You need to close it. Mile marker 66. Hurry." Every rule I had learned told me to ignore the message. Mile marker 66 was forbidden ground. Nothing good came from responding to calls at that location. But this was Ricardo, the man who had trained me, who had taught me to survive. And he was telling me to break the rules. The drive to mile marker 66 was the longest of my life. The phenomena lined the highway like spectators at a parade, figures and vehicles and impossible objects that watched my cruiser pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hunger. They didn't try to stop me. If anything, they seemed to be clearing a path, guiding me toward the location that every officer had been warned to avoid. The storm had arrived in full force by the time I reached the exit, rain hammering against my windshield with a ferocity that overwhelmed the wipers. Lightning split the sky in jagged lines, illuminating the desert landscape in brief, terrifying snapshots. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying sounds that weren't entirely wind, voices and screams, and something that might have been laughter. I parked my cruiser at the edge of the road and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through my uniform immediately, cold enough to make me shiver, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on what stood at mile marker 66. It was the red door from November, the one that had vanished from the evidence cage. But it had grown. Where before it had been a single door, human-sized, now it towered 3 stories tall, its surface pulsing with a light that wasn't quite light, an illumination that seemed to darken everything around it rather than brighten it. The brass knob had been replaced by something organic, a handle that writhed with its own animation, and the door was open. Through the doorway, I could see a world that wasn't our world. The sky was the wrong color, a bruised purple-green that hurt to look at. The ground was covered in structures that might have been buildings, but their geometry was wrong, angles that shouldn't have existed, proportions that made my eyes water. Things moved in that world, creatures that had no earthly equivalent, forms that my brain struggled to process. Standing in front of the door, his back to me, was Ricardo Vasquez. He turned as I approached, and I saw that he was young again, restored to the vitality he had possessed when I first met him. But his eyes held that same distant look, the one he had worn since his recovery from the desert, the one that suggested he was seeing 2 realities at once. "You came," he said, and his voice was clear despite the storm, as if he existed in a pocket of calm amidst the chaos. "I wasn't sure you would." "What is this, Ricardo? What's happening?" "The barriers are failing," he said, gesturing toward the open door. "They've been weakening for decades. Every death on these highways, every tragedy, every moment of fear and despair, all of it has been feeding into this place, this threshold, and now it's strong enough to open, strong enough to let them through." As if to emphasize his words, something emerged from the doorway. It was massive, a shape that suggested a spider but with too many legs, too many eyes, a body that seemed to phase in and out of physical existence. It stepped onto the highway and immediately began to grow, feeding on the reality around it, consuming the very substance of our world. "How do I stop it?" I demanded. Ricardo reached into his pocket and withdrew the leather-bound book of rules, the same one he had given me on my first night. But this copy was different, older, its pages yellowed with age. He pressed it into my hands. "The rules aren't just protection," he explained. "They're containment. Every rule that's followed, Every officer who survives by heeding them strengthens the barriers. But there's one rule that's never been written, one protocol that exists only in oral tradition, passed from officer to officer. Because if it were written, if it became known, they would find a way to counter it. The spider thing was almost fully materialized now, its attention turning toward us, countless eyes reflecting the lightning that split the sky. What rule? I shouted over the wind. To close a door that opens from the other side, you have to want to go through. You have to choose the darkness willingly, and then you have to reject it completely at the moment of crossing. The contradiction, the impossibility of wanting and rejecting at the same time, creates a paradox, and paradoxes collapse the thresholds. I understood what he was asking. He was asking me to walk toward that door, to embrace the oblivion it promised, and then to turn away at the last possible second. If I succeeded, the threshold would collapse. If I failed, I will be lost forever. Why me? I asked. Because you've been following the rules, Ricardo said. 3 years, not a single violation. Every officer who survives by following the rules becomes a kind of anchor for our reality. The longer you follow them, the stronger you become. Right now, tonight, you're the strongest anchor we have. The spider thing had noticed us now, its massive bulk turning in our direction, legs that could span city blocks beginning to move. I looked at the door, at the nightmare world beyond it, at the creatures that waited on the other side. Then I looked at Ricardo, at the peace in his eyes, at the acceptance that had replaced the confusion. What happens to you? I asked. I'm already gone, he said gently. I've been since that night in the desert. What you're seeing is just the part of me that they let return, the part that could deliver this message at this moment. I've been waiting 3 years for you to be ready, James. Don't let my waiting be for nothing. The spider thing was closing the distance between us with terrifying speed, each step sending tremors through the earth. I ran, not away from the door, but toward it. I ran with every ounce of strength I possessed, focusing on the oblivion that waited beyond the threshold, embracing the darkness with every fiber of my being. I wanted it. In that moment, I genuinely wanted to step through, to leave behind the nightmares and the sleepless days and the endless patrol. The doorway loomed before me, close enough to touch, close enough to cross. The world on the other side reached out to receive me, tendrils of that wrong-colored air wrapping around my arms. And then, at the last possible instant, I thought of Elena. I thought of the officers who had died, of Tommy Breslin and all the others who had been lost. I thought of the people driving these highways, the families and travelers and ordinary citizens who depended on us to keep them safe. I thought of every sunrise I had watched from the parking lot overlooking the ocean, every reminder that night always ended, that darkness always retreated. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay. I wanted to live. The contradiction tore through me like lightning, an impossibility that couldn't exist, but did anyway. I was reaching forward and pulling back at the same time, crossing the threshold and refusing to cross, embracing the darkness while holding onto the light. The door screamed. There's no other way to describe it. The red door, the threshold between worlds, emitted a sound that was pure agony, a universe-sized scream of frustration and rage. The spider thing dissolved into fragments of shadow that scattered on the wind. The doorway began to shrink, collapsing in on itself, pulling back into whatever dimension it had come from. The last thing I saw before the door closed completely was Ricardo's face, smiling with genuine warmth for the first time since I had known him. His lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Thank you. And the door was gone. The storm began to subside, and I was alone on the side of the highway, kneeling on wet asphalt, the leather-bound book of rules clutched in my trembling hands. The rest of that night passed in a blur. I returned to my cruiser and completed my patrol in a daze. The phenomena had retreated, not just to their usual levels of activity, but almost completely. The highways were quieter than I had ever experienced them, the darkness holding nothing more threatening than shadows cast by passing headlights. At dawn, I drove to the parking lot, overlooking the ocean, and watched the sun rise. Elena joined me a few minutes later, her face showing the strain of the night's events. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the lights spread across the water. The activity dropped to almost nothing after 3:30, she finally said. Reports came in from every sector. Whatever happened to mile marker 66, it worked. Ricardo's gone, I told her. Really gone this time. Elena nodded slowly. I suspected as much. He was waiting for this, holding on for years, just to see it through. He can rest now. I looked down at the book in my hands, at the rules that had saved my life countless times, at the blank pages in the back that waited for new observations. Then I opened to the last written page and added a final note in the margin. Rule 38. When the door appears, remember why you chose to stay. The midnight shift continues. I still patrol the highways of San Diego, still face the phenomena that emerge after dark, still follow the rules that keep me alive. But something is different now. The encounters are less frequent, less intense, as if something fundamental shifted that night at mile marker 66. The other officers have noticed the change. New recruits hear stories that sound more like folklore than reality. Tales of the days when the phenomena were stronger, when every night brought encounters that defied explanation. They learn the rules, of course, because the rules still matter, but they don't fully understand the weight of what they're protecting against. And maybe that's for the best. I'll retire eventually. Not yet. Not for a few more years, but eventually. When I do, I'll pass the book to someone else, someone who has proven themselves capable of carrying its weight. I'll share the unwritten rule, the one that closed the door, so that if it ever opens again, there will be someone ready to close it. Until then, I drive. I patrol. I keep watch over the highways while the city sleeps, making sure that the darkness stays where it belongs. The blue lights of my cruiser cut through the night, a beacon of order in a world that contains far more chaos than most people will ever know. I am a guardian of the threshold, a protector of the boundary between what is and what should never be. And when you drive these highways after midnight, when you see those blue lights in your rearview mirror, know that there's someone out there watching over you, someone who knows the rules, someone who will never break them.